Thank you for joining us today for another interview on human fluence. Today we have our distinguished guest for this enlightening conversation, none other than John Burke, a renowned author and pastor celebrated for his insightful exploration of the fascinating intersection between near-death experiences and biblical scripture. John's seminal work, including his latest book, Imagine the God of Heaven, has captivated many individuals, including myself, offering fresh and illuminating perspectives on the afterlife and a deep connection to spirituality. Having personally delved into numerous near-death experiences myself, and I can attest that they are not only eye-opening and open up doors to the mysteries of the afterlife, but they also invite us to ponder the nature of consciousness, the boundaries of human understanding, and the potential for spiritual experiences that transcend traditional religious confines. A heartfelt welcome, John. Thank you for joining us today.
Hey, Joe, great to be on the show. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
In a world seeking light amid darkness, we must ignite awakened consciousness, awaken your soul, ignite your inner fire, evoke your inner wisdom. For when you confront your own shadow, you unveil your inner light, human fluence, creating a new reality.
When people clinically die, their heart stops beating, brainwaves cease, and yet they're resuscitated, whether by modern medicine. And we're talking sometimes after, a few seconds, sometimes minutes, but sometimes hours. I mean, we're talking about hours with no brainwaves, and yet they come back, and what they say they experienced and how their consciousness lived on and what they experienced, it blew me away. So I picked this book up and I start reading it, and I couldn't put it down. I read the whole thing in one night. And my first thought was, wow, okay, this could actually be like medical scientific evidence that this afterlife and this God stuff that these people have always been telling me about, that it might be real. And so I wasn't convinced from that. I was just more open. And then I did start exploring more and studying more. And I came to faith in Jesus. I, in time, left engineering to become a pastor, really I ended up starting a church 25 years ago for people like me, skeptics, doubters, strugglers, ordinary people, not people who are already convinced and already go to church, but really for people who, were where I was. And turns out there are a lot of them. It's been really cool to see, honestly, because I do think when people are given space, safe space to explore, to ask hard questions, to wrestle, I think truth is really out there. It can be found. And yeah, so that was that was kind of my journey. Now, because of what you said, it was really true. Back in the 80s when I first started studying this, and I've over the last 3 decades, I've studied well over 1,000 cases of near-death experience, interviewed hundreds of them, a lot of them my friends today. And initially, people were very, very skeptical. However, what convinced me and what convinced many skeptical medical doctors even is that there's really great, hard, factual evidence that these are not just something that happens in the brain, that these are a real experience of a life that transcends our, finite 4 dimensions of time and space.
Absolutely, which flips people's beliefs on their head sometimes, because the idea that, consciousness goes on, that the fact that there might actually be something after this life, aside from what we've been taught, in mainstream life as we go on, whether it's through religion, whether it's through, culture. So I'm curious about these. I was an agnostic myself, and I still am, and I'm trying to figure these things out. I'm curious, as far as skeptics, most people say that these near-death experiences are a result of neurological processes or a DMT release. What have you to say to people that say those sorts of rebuttals?
Yeah. So in my new book, Imagine the God of Heaven, chapter 2 is science, skeptics, and NDEs. And I address that because there have actually been about 30 alternative explanations. You know, the common explanation that someone who has a near-death experience gives is that life goes on. I was still myself. I left my body. I had not just 5 senses, more like 50 senses. And I saw what was going on in the room, all this. I traveled to this place of exquisite beauty. I meet this God of light and love, my relatives and friends who had gone on, all these different things. And there have been, like I said, 30 alternate explanations other than life goes on. Now, one of the things I write about in chapter 2 is if there was one good alternate explanation that made sense of all the data, why would they need 30? And what you see, the truth is, there's a different one kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall to see if something will stick every year. So for instance, CNN, I just saw an article, of course, everybody sends them to me. Hey, did you see this? CNN just comes out with near-death experiences are just a blip in the brain, study shows. Now, if you actually read the article to the end, they weren't even saying that because that's not what the study showed. That was just clickbait. But what, and I know the doctors that were reporting on it, and that's, what the headline was not what they were saying. But so I give 10 points of evidence in my chapter 2 that convince me and many skeptical medical doctors. 10 points of evidence that I think any alternative explanation has got to make sense of. I'll just run through a couple of them. Verifiable observations of resuscitation. So when someone clinically dies, they say they leave their body, but they still had a spiritual body. They were still themselves. In fact, they say you're more yourself than you've ever been because you're free, you realize. Mm-hmm. And in this spiritual body, many of them say initially they're still in the room where their resuscitation is taking place. Now, again, they have no heartbeat, no brain waves. And yet they're making observations of what's going on in the room, who's in the room, what's happening, things that they could not have known because their brain wasn't recording anything. And so when they come back, they're able to describe these things. I'll give you an example. In Holland, a man was found unconscious in a park. So he didn't have any heartbeat. He was brought into the ER. They were going to do chest compressions, and the nurse noticed he had dentures. So took the dentures out, put him in the lower drawer of the crash cart, intubated him, and then they shocked his heart. They got it started again, but he never came to in the ER. They wheeled him out to another room. A week later, he becomes conscious, and he's missing his dentures, and he's complaining about it. And then he sees a nurse and he says, that nurse knows where my dentures are. And then he says, I was right there trying to get everybody's attention. He named who all was in the room, what happened. And when that nurse took his dentures and put them in the lower drawer of the bottle, the cart with all the bottles, he said. And that's where they found them. Now, there are many such observations made. Each NDE may make 5 or 10 observations. So Dr. Janice Holden actually did a study. So she took about 100 patients of cardiac arrest who had claimed to have an NDE, mm-hmm. and listened to their verifiable observations, checked them out. 92% of their observations were 100% accurate. 92%, completely accurate. Another 6% had some variation. 2% were inaccurate. Turns out that was one of the patients in the study. So compared to just regular cardiac arrest who don't claim to have had an NDE, they've also done that as a control group and just asking, what do you think happened in your resuscitation? And they're just guessing. They're just saying what they've seen on ER, not even close. So that's just one, verifiable observations. But that does ground this experience in our reality, right? It grounds it in truth. That for me was like, whoa, okay. If we can believe them about what they say they observe, then why not believe them about what they continued to observe? Okay, second, common elements. So I talk about there are all these common elements. And in my first book, Imagine Heaven, there are about 40 common elements that people report when they have near-death experiences all around the world. And I just went through some of them, but others are like communication that's pure, thought to thought, heart to heart. You know, some describe it as telepathic, but it's more than that. And others talk about things like the light, that the light of heaven comes out of everything. And it's not just light like the sun. It's love and it's life all together. So there are these commonalities. Now, if these near-death experiences are just like Dr. Michael Shermer, who, you know, he's a skeptic, and he says they're just something that happens in the brain. Initially, he said it's the chemicals flooding the brain to just ease the fear of dying. But then he realized, okay, that doesn't make sense of the evidence. So now he's saying it is when someone is coming back. It's kind of like when the brain's rebooting, suddenly it's having all these things happen, and that's what they're saying. Well, if it were just in the brain, then why wouldn't it, as a human thing, why wouldn't the elements all be consistent? But they're not. So for instance, a life review, about 32% of near-death experiencers report having a life review. 57% report meeting their deceased loved ones. Okay, but if it's just in the brain, why wouldn't 100% say they met their deceased loved ones?
Sure.
And you could keep going. 48% say they experienced and encounter this God of light and love. Why just 48%? And more telling, and that's what I'm trying to show in Imagine the God of Heaven. Why would people from all different religious backgrounds who had maybe very different expectations, including people who didn't believe there even was a God, experience the same God and describe the same God the same way? So verifiable observations, common elements that just a brain blip doesn't describe. Blind people, when they have a near-death experience, can see. And they report the same things as sighted people and things that they would never have heard on earth. You know, so like I was telling you about the light, they say the light of heaven comes out of everything, right? Mm-hmm. Well, blind people say the same thing. I mean, I've interviewed, I think there are 3 or 4 in the new book, in Imagine the God of Heaven. And they talk about this light, and in God's presence, this light that is love and that's brighter than the sun, but doesn't feel like the sun. Feels more like love and peace and this overwhelming joy that they feel. And then they say light was coming out of the plants and out of the grass and out of the birds and out of the trees and even out of the people. Now, a blind person would never have heard that light shines out of things. On earth, they would have heard, because they can't see, they would have heard light shines on things. So where would they ever get the idea that light shines out of things when you die? And yet that's consistent with what sighted people having near-death experiences say. Now, as you pointed out, you know, my fascination is showing how the ancient wisdom of the Bible correlates. And interestingly, in the book of Isaiah, so Isaiah is a Jewish prophet writing in 780 BCE, and he says, in heaven, there is no sun or moon, for God is its light. And then fast forward, Revelation 21, this is John, so this is in like 90 AD. And John says he was taken up to see this, and he says the same thing. He says, the glory of God is the light, and the Lamb, referring to Jesus, is its lamp, and the nations will walk in that light. Well, that's exactly what near-death experiencers around the world say, is that this light of heaven is is coming out of everything. Even Daniel in Daniel chapter 12, another Jewish prophet, and then Jesus, Matthew chapter 13 says, in heaven, then the righteous will shine like the sun in their Father's kingdom. So that we too will have this light and life and love of God filling us and coming out of us. Well, that's exactly what a blind, this Debbie, this blind near-death experiencer reports.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's very
That's just three. So that's just 3 of my 10 points of evidence that, I find that most of the alternate explanations, they're not even trying to answer those questions. Like, how do you make sense of this?
Mm-hmm. We brought up a few common themes: the light, seeing deceased relatives, meeting God, or a light. What are some other common themes that arise? And I do want to tie a little bit more of what Jesus said in the Bible to what people experience.
Well, yeah. So one of the things that near-death experiencers commonly say is, for instance, I talked about they have a spiritual body. Interestingly, Paul in the New Testament, I think, probably had a near-death experience. In the book of Acts, which traces Paul's journeys, and Paul, for those who don't know, he was Saul. He was a Pharisee. He was one of the ones that were anti-Jesus. And in fact, he was traveling around arresting the first followers of Jesus, putting them in prison, having some of them killed, because he thought this is blasphemy against God. And then it says in Acts chapter 9, he's going to Damascus to arrest these Jesus people when this brilliant light appears. Sound familiar? And he knows this is God. And he says, "Who are you, Lord?" And the light says, "I'm Jesus, who you're persecuting." Now, he doesn't tell him anything else. And I think that's a very important thing. Paul ends up going back, and someone comes to him and explains more of the message of Jesus. But I think that's an important point in understanding near-death experiences, because just because God appears to someone in a near-death experience does not take away their free will. And I believe that God's whole point of our existence is love, that God is love, and God is trying to teach us to love. But love requires free will. And that means, you can fall in love with someone, but you can't buy their love. You can't force their love. You can't manipulate or coerce their love, not if it's true love. And that's true even for God. So even like in Paul's sake, we're also in near-death experiences. When they come back, they still have a free will of whether they will seek God and his love and follow God or not. And so that's just one, so Paul, I got sidetracked, but Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians or in Acts chapter 14, it says that Paul was basically a mob turned on him and stoned him to death. So he gets stoned with rocks. He gets stoned in Lystra with rocks and dragged out of the city and left for dead. And then it says, and then he got back up and goes back in the city while they were all gathered around him. And then he says in 2 Corinthians 12, 14 years ago, whether I was in my body or out of my body, I'm not sure. Only God knows. But I was taken up into the third heaven, and I saw and heard and experienced things inexpressible, some things no one is allowed to tell. And then Paul talks about this spiritual body having new powers, buried in weakness, raised in power. And all these things he talks about correlates with what near-death experiencers report today. So they leave their body, they feel all these new powers of sight, telescopic vision, which, another fascinating thing. I mean, people say in their near-death experience, like, I could see I could see every vein on a leaf of a tree miles away, right? And interestingly, in the book of Revelation, John says he was also taken up into heaven, and he's looking at this city of God, and he says he was up on a very high mountain, and yet he says he read what was on the gates and the foundations, then these names. Well, how? How do you do that from up on a very high mountain unless you have telescopic vision?
Right.
And yet again, this is exactly what NDEs around the world are attesting to. A welcoming committee. People say that they often, they travel through, many times it's a tunnel, but it's not always a tunnel. Sometimes it's like through outer space. But I mean, at super, the speed of light kind of speeds, and they come to this place of exquisite beauty. And many times they have this welcoming committee of people who died before them. Now, interestingly, Jesus in Matthew 13 says, use your worldly resources to make friends in this life. And then when it's all gone, they will welcome you into an eternal home. Fascinating. That's exactly what they experience. Like I said in that same chapter, Jesus talks about how we will shine like the sun. I believe that's actually the experience of the very life and light and love of God that resonates and shines through us, and not always, which is fascinating. Because when people meet their loved ones, they don't always see them as this, human with light coming out of them. And by the way, often when that happens, they're wearing a particular robe, which is it took me a while to figure that out. You hear about that in near-death experiences. They were wearing these white robes, but that's also in the Bible as well. But what I finally realized is those white robes, I think, are not white at all. They're translucent. And somehow it's kind of like they let the light and the love of God shine out of us to others. And so, I mean, I can go on and on and on. Time. They say, near-death experiencers say time doesn't work the same way. Some of them say, well, there was no time. But I don't think that's it, because others say, no, there was time, but it didn't work the same way. And interestingly, in 2 Peter 3, this is one of Jesus' disciples, he says, don't forget that to the Lord, a 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. And in Imagine the God of Heaven, I talk about how, if we experience time in one dimension, right? So our time is linear, only going in one direction. You can never go back, and you can only go forward in one direction. But imagine if you had two dimensions of time. So imagine that timeline, and then on each point of that timeline, there's another timeline going north infinitely. So on every moment of a one-dimensional experience of time, you would have all the time in the world to experience that moment before you move to another moment.
Sure.
And then if you had three dimensions of time, imagine like more of a globe, where the one dimension's the equator, and the second dimension are the longitudinal lines going up to one point of time, the North Pole. And so that would be a third dimension of time. So from that one point of time, you would experience the beginning and the end, and simultaneously every point of time with all the time in the world. Now, interestingly, Jesus said in Revelation, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. So I think he's talking about, he lives beyond our time, but able to experience three-dimensional time. So, I mean, there are all kinds of wild confluences, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it just kind of blows your mind. I mean, this is what why I get so excited about it, because one, I think it is grounded in reality. Like we can find good reasons to believe they're telling the truth. But it also gives such hope. It's like, I mean, I know for me, like I came at this when my dad was dying, and he did die. And that was a real, I didn't even believe in God, but I was starting to kind of go like, well, okay, God, if you're there, then heal my dad. that, we in those crisis points, that's when we start to pray. And then he didn't. And so I was like, well, screw that. Yeah, I mean, I really was. I was like, why would I want anything to do with you if you are real? And that's really where I was at. But what I realized even in that moment, is that, okay, if there is no God and this life is all there is, then there's nothing good that's ever going to come out of this. Like, it just sucks. My dad died, my best friend. And that's it. But if this is true, then there is hope for all of the pains and the sufferings and the difficulties and the struggles. Like, it all can actually be made worth something. And this life is not actually the end, it's the beginning. It's like the first chapter of the rest of the story.
It's the dream that you wake up from.
Yeah.
I love that. I want to talk a little bit about a life review. Many people experience a life review. Many of them differ from what mainstream belief might say God does when we die or doesn't do. I'm curious how they align with Christian teachings, and for those that have departed, the concept of a loving and forgiving God, as portrayed in the Bible.
Yeah. So commonly and it's most commonly in the presence of this God of light and love. And sometimes he'll ask them, or sometimes he'll just say, hey, I want you to see some things. But he'll say, I want to show you your life. And again, because time doesn't work the same way, they literally are reliving their lives. And sometimes it's the entire life, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's things that apparently God is trying to show them. Now, I think an important thing to understand, Joe, is that these are not crossing over into eternity. So this is not full biological death. And it took me a while to understand this. And I think that's important because it gives some understanding to some things. So one of the commonalities people talk about is a border or a boundary they knew they couldn't cross over and still come back. And in some cases, in the new book, Imagine the God of Heaven, Jesus even tells them, you haven't died yet, you have to go back. And yet they didn't have any brainwaves and they had no heartbeat. So from our point of death, they had. So I think these near-death experiences are something in between. And there's still a tie to this life. They haven't broken that tie yet. They haven't crossed over fully. And I think that's important, because what that means is that what happens in the near-death experience is also a learning. And I think I think these are God's testimony to us as well. In other words, sending them back. And sometimes he even says that, I'm sending you back and I want you to tell everything you've seen and heard. Mm-hmm. And so it's not only for them to learn, it's also for us to learn. So the life review, they relive their lives many times from a panoramic, three-dimensional perspective. It's like they're watching themselves go through life, but the emphasis is on their interactions with people. That's a key theme. And they're not only remembering what they were thinking and feeling, it's like they are reliving it, but from a third perspective, as well as what it felt like and what they were thinking and all that, but also from the perspective of the other person they were interacting with. They
Right.
feel what it felt like. They know what that person was thinking. They see the whole context of everything going on. And so what they come back saying consistently is not only God is love, but how we love, how we treat one another is what God cares about most. I mean, that's consistent across the globe. Doesn't matter on their background. Now, interestingly, that's exactly when Jesus was asked, in Matthew chapter 22, it says Jesus was asked by the Pharisees what the greatest commandments were. And he said, love God, that's number one. But then he said, but the second is like it. In other words, you can't separate the two. And the second is love your neighbor as you do yourself.
Right.
And then he said, these two sum up all the commands of the Bible. Now think about that. It's like, that gives you context. And that's where so many things get missed and misinterpreted. It's like, if it's not about love, we're missing the point, right? God's point is love. And sometimes love is hard. I mean, some love hits up against truth too. It's like sometimes love will let a child actually go to jail for continuing to do cocaine and steal and rob. And that's the most loving thing. That's hard.
It's tough love.
But it is love. It is, and it's about love. So another cool thing about the life review is that, like in the case of this one spine surgeon, Dr. Mary Neal, that I interviewed, like she said, Jesus showed her the ripple effect of her actions, 30 and 40 people out. Like when you do something kind for another person, you think no big deal. Penny, another one I interviewed, said that God showed her not only the like a time when she was in line and there was a single mom who was having to figure out how to put groceries back because she didn't have enough money. And Penny just said, hey, I got it for you. Right. And she was so overwhelmed with gratitude. But then God shows her how that woman then ended up going and starting to serve the homeless at a food bank. And so Dr. Mary Neal gets the same idea, is that, and even she said something we would call good or bad, right? So that happened to me and that was bad, or that happened to me and that was good. And yet she saw how when you take it 20, 30 times out from yourself, how God really does use it for good, for your good and for others' good when we're willing to seek, to really seek the God of love. And so, yeah, I mean, the life review changes people drastically.
Yeah, in the same line of the seeing far and hearing everything, and everything is just hyper, all your senses are on fire when you are over there in the spirit realm, so to speak. You were saying, they could not only see things far away, but the same thing with the life review. People have described that panoramic view, seeing their whole life flash before their eyes, and literally seeing everything around them. So it's the same. It goes in line with that as well. Just being able to see it. Yeah.
Yeah, and every life review I've noticed is a little unique and different. I mean, which again, I mean, God is so creative, and if we miss that, we're missing God. I mean, God, if God is real, which I believe he is, and created all of this, well, we've categorized 2 million species of life form so far, right? But our scientists tell us they're more like 7 to 8 million, because we keep finding hundreds of thousands of new ones every year. That's incredibly creative, and a sense of humor. And that's part of what I'm trying to do in Imagine the God of Heaven, is I'm trying to show people we all put God in a box. We're finite, so we have to. And maybe you've got them in a box from, like I grew up being taken to church until I just couldn't stand it anymore, because the box was just this very kind of stoic religious tradition. I didn't get it. It didn't make sense. It didn't seem to connect to the real world at all. And God was in that box too. God was, if there was a God, he's, kind of in stained glass somewhere watching, but not involved, and kind of frowning too. Right.
Yeah.
And we all do. I mean, we maybe our image of God is shaped by our parents, for better or for worse, or authority figures or religious figures, or, but it's finite for all of us. And so what I'm trying to show people is, God is far more beautiful. We probably wouldn't use that word, but near-death experiencers do. Glorious, powerful, sovereign, all those biblical words. Yeah, but what do they mean? And that's what I'm trying to show. When you see through the eyes of these people what they experience, it's like, wow. I mean, like this one woman, Suzanne, she was 12. Her scarf actually got caught around the tow rope at a ski resort, and she got drugged up the mountain. It was brutal. But God is so merciful, because she didn't experience the death of what happened to her.
Right.
Instead, she experiences Jesus and these two angels coming and taking her. And she talked about how in Jesus' presence, it was just like being with this like wonderful, loving big brother or father who just like got you, just like so comfortable. But then at one point they're sitting under this huge tree, she said, and there are mountains off in the background, this beautiful grass by this river. And she's sitting in his lap. She's a little 12-year-old girl, right? And he says to her, I'm much more than you see right now. And then she talks about how this light starts to come up over the mountains, forming, she said it wasn't a hand, but it kind of looked like a hand, but a hand that covered the sky, and this light of gold that came and touched and merged with the light of white that was coming out of Jesus. And like this little 12-year-old girl gets at that, oh, these two are one. And there's so many fascinating things like that. This Jewish girl, 16-year-old Jewish girl, Heidi. So she grows up in a very abusive home. Her dad was a lawyer. He was an atheist. Her mom was an agnostic. Her dad had a mantra. He said to her and her two sisters every night, "There is no God. Your life is as worthless as a speck of dust. Jesus Christ is the biggest hoax ever perpetrated on mankind." That's what she grew up with. But she always believed in God, and she always prayed to God. And as a little kid growing up, every night, she said she would pray, and she would just talk to God about all the abuses and things going on. And she felt comforted. She felt like he was actually there comforting her, helping her relax and go to sleep at night. Well, then at age 16, she rode horseback, bareback, loved speed. Her horse ends up running into another horse, rears up, falls over, and crushes her. So Heidi's now 30 feet up above her body, watching the scene of the accident. And she said, "I knew I was dead, but I wasn't troubled. I felt great." She said, "I was just sad my sisters had to see me die like that." And then she sees a light coming over her right side, and she kind of realized that it was a cloudy day. It wasn't the sun, because the sun would be over there. And she turns and looks, and there, floating 30 feet up with her, she said, is Jesus. And she said, "I wasn't sitting there thinking, what's a good Jewish girl like me doing with Jesus? I'm not supposed to be with Jesus." She said, "No, I knew this man. I knew him." And she said, I knew he was the one I had been praying to my whole life. Now, interestingly, he then gives her a life review. And he's just grinning ear to ear, she said, just like it was this incredibly happy reunion for both of them. And then they're watching her life. And at one point, there's some hilarious things. So like at one point, they just both start cracking up because she was a little infant in a crib and her mom had a friend come over with another little infant and they put the other infant in the crib and that other infant took Heidi's rattle and whacked her on the nose. And she wasn't hurt. She was just indignant and they both knew it. Yeah. And they just both started cracking up. And then, but Jesus shows her in the life review that when she used to pray as a child, when she was praying, she saw him sitting by her bedside, comforting her and rocking her to sleep, which is bizarre. But it's even more bizarre when you consider how she grew up. Right. And that she believed in God, but she didn't believe in Jesus. But then Jesus takes her hand, okay? After that, he takes her hand and he gets this huge grin on his face. Now, again, this is where, we got to expand our box that we've got God in because we don't think God's very fun. Right? I mean, another. You would not.
The Bible would describe him as not so fun at times.
Well, that is true because he is also just. But yes. Interestingly, God set up 7 street parties. They were these huge festivals for the nation of Israel that every year they were to come together 7 times. And he said, I want you to rejoice and celebrate before me. Bring food, bring drink, rejoice and celebrate. Why? Because he's the God of joy. The whole last section of Imagine the God of Heaven is about the God of joy. Because this is one that Christians really miss. But Jesus last night on earth, he said, I've told you these things. He's talking to his closest friends, his disciples. He says, I've told you these things so that my joy may be in you and your joy would overflow. Mm-hmm. But we miss that. But Heidi didn't, because here she is with Jesus and he takes her hand and he gets this huge grin on his face. And she said, and we took off. She said, we took off at first through our atmosphere, but then like into outer space. And he was grinning from ear to ear. And she said, it was like we were flying like Superman and Lois Lane, but we had this wave of light under our feet. And she said, I could feel it. So I was barefoot, but I could feel it. And she said he was just like, we were bantering and joking the whole time. Which, I'll be honest, the first time I heard it, I was like, I don't know. But then I heard several teenagers who had near-death experiences tell me about having the same kind of experience with Jesus. One was a doctor and his wife who came to our church because their 4-year-old had died in the hospital and then was resuscitated. At 4 years old, he starts saying to them, I want to go run and play in the fields with Jesus again. And they were like, who told you about Jesus? We didn't tell you about Jesus. They didn't let a 4-year-old watch TV. They never went to church. They didn't believe in God or Jesus. And so he kept saying this. And so that kind of opened them up and someone invited them to our church and they started to learn and all that and then came up to me and told me that. But another 14-year-old, a 12-year-old, similar kinds of things. And so I write about that. We somehow think that all the things we love, all the pleasures, all the things that are wonderful about life, we made up. But if there's a God, no, he created us with the ability to experience those pleasures, to enjoy life, all the thrills, all the wonders, all the excitement, all the love, all of that. And so why would we think God is less than we are? Yeah. And I think that's just the box that we tend to put him in.
Yeah, given today's state of affairs, I want to touch real quickly on Christ consciousness. I don't know if you're familiar with that term, but whether or not people believe in the rapture and Jesus Christ returning in the flesh, or as an idea of Christ consciousness, unity, love, treating thy neighbor as thyself, loving thy neighbor as thyself. The golden rule, basically, that
Yeah.
if it's a God of love and light, and we're here to love and learn and grow, um, obviously that's kind of a stark contrast to the world nowadays. But I'm curious on your take on all that.
Well, you mean from the perspective of where we are in this time and age and day and all that?
Yeah, in this time and
Yeah.
day and age, and what words of wisdom or encouragement you might have from your work, or
Well, I'll
basically, I
tell
mean,
you.
yeah,
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot because, um, especially with all the vitriol that is seeming to increase, not just global conflicts, which obviously there are those, and, some very entrenched, but also just, the r- racism and hatred and, just, man, I mean, I've seen it myself where on Facebook, people who are friends just make assumptions about what I think or don't think because of this or that, and just a dump truck of assumptions, and then just defriend you and say nasty things on the way out the Facebook door, right? And I see that increasing. Now, at the same time, I fully believe that, just like you said, one of the reasons, and I've noticed too, these near-death experiences are increasing. I don't know that the experience is increasing, but what's increasing is that we're able to hear from all around the globe these testimonies of people everywhere, for the first time. I mean, it wouldn't even have happened 5 years ago, and yet now, there are people on YouTube from all over the world, and like I said, in Imagine the God of Heaven, I interviewed 70 people from every continent. Hindus from India, Muslim imams from Rwanda, a woman in Tehran, a professor in Hong Kong, Australian lawyer. I mean, you name it, all over the globe. And I think that God is giving testimony of his love for all nations. That, look, he created us all to be his children. And it actually breaks his heart when we disconnect from God's love. And as a result, we end up treating one another in very unloving ways. And I think he's giving us a way back, because I think that is the way back. I think the way back is that, God is incredibly forgiving. He forgives everything. We didn't even touch on that, but you're right. In the life review, they're kind of shocked because they see their good and their bad. And I mean, and they often say, God wasn't judging me. God was loving me. I was judging myself. I knew. And there's no hiding from the truth. But at the same time, what he's trying to show is that, the answer is love, but God's the source of love. And so we got to go back to the source. And as we go back to the source, and this is a moment by moment going back to the source. This is a right in the middle of an argument with your spouse, and you're losing it, and you just yelled at, whatever. And you stop and you realize, whoa, okay, that was not what God wanted me to do. And there's forgiveness. Because and this, by the way, Joe, I think this is the message of Jesus. I think he died on the cross to pay for all our wrongs, past, present, even the future ones. And here's why. So we won't stay disconnected from the source. Because when we do wrong, we tend to get condemned and shamed, and we hear this voice like, God, if there is a God, man, he didn't want anything to do with you because you're horrible. Well, all that does is keep us disconnected from the very source of life and love. And so forgiveness, the recognition that God is forgiving, allows us to, in that moment, go, I'm sorry, help me. And you get, and he does. And then he wants us to do the same for one another, because we hurt one another, and hurt people, and on it goes. But it is reversible. And so, that's my prayer, is that as much as, the hatred and the vitriol and all that is increasing, is that maybe more and more people will hear about the truth of what these people are reporting. And I think what God's been saying all along in the scriptures, and that we will start to learn from him. How do we better love one another? And it can turn the tide.
Absolutely. I love that. I want to know, are there any projects you're working on now? Any new books? What do you got coming up?
Yeah, I'm working on a lot. So I was just in a movie, After Death, which set box office records. So now they're talking about an episodic kind of thing based on Imagine Heaven, my first book. So that's one thing potentially, and then I've got a couple other books that I'm working on, really looking more into how we live our purpose, and kind of like, what the life review and what these NDEs teach us about the nuances of purpose, and when it gets confusing, especially.
I love that. This life journey is a long one, a fun one, a challenging one. And I remember, growing up trying to find my purpose and what brings me passion and all this. And as they say, it's really one of those things where purpose finds you, and it's just about riding the journey and staying present and trusting God. So
Yeah.
thank you, John, for being on today. I appreciate it so much. Can you share with the audience where they can find more about you, get your books, and all that fun stuff?
Yeah, you can go to imaginethegodofheaven.com. Imagine, just the book name, imaginethegodofheaven.com. And the books are all out on Amazon or any bookstore, Costco, Walmart, wherever you shop. except not HEB or the grocery store near you.
Anything you want to leave the audience with before we hop off, John?
Yes. Just remember, if there's one thing I've learned over 35 years of studying these near-death experiences and about Jesus, is that you are far more loved than you can possibly imagine. And you are unique, and only God really knows who you are and what makes you tick, even more than you do. And that's what I've realized. And nobody gets you more. And really, it's crazy about you more than any grandparent or parent ever could be.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Well, everyone, thank you so much for enjoying today's episode. Please drop a comment, like, subscribe, and connect with John. Read his books. I'm going to tell you, these near-death experiences open up a whole rabbit hole of research and thought-provoking stuff. So it's something you definitely should look at and read his books, and it's really a never-ending journey of learning. So thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
In a world seeking light amid darkness, we must ignite awakened consciousness, awaken your soul, ignite your inner fire, evoke your inner wisdom. For when you confront your own shadow, you unveil your inner light, human fluence, creating a new reality.